Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of The National Interest, and it is my pleasure today to host two Center for the National Interest Fellows, Greg Priddy and Joshua Yaphe. We are going to discuss the anniversary of October 7th, which is obviously today, and the consequences that it has led to in the Middle East, which is currently embroiled in a regional war that many fear could spiral out of control, and that the Biden administration has tried to contain, but so far failed to do so. We'll start off with Greg, followed by Josh, and then I'll ask a few questions. And I encourage anyone who is viewing this to put a question into the Q&A box. Greg, please take it away.
Thanks, Jacob. I'm going to start off just to talk for a few minutes about where we are with recent events and kind of the decision tree of potential for escalation from here. We frame the question as, will there be a wider war? And the answer to that, in a binary sense, is pretty clearly yes. But there's a lot of questions about, will this be an exchange between Israel and Iran? Or would this escalate to something that would be wider for the region, potentially impacting U.S. forces there and the Gulf Arabs? And there are some important fire breaks between those things. So I don't think it's clear at this point that things are going to escalate beyond Iran. And there are some reasons that militate against, that pull back against that happening. In terms of those fire breaks. Iran has clearly hit the point with its second missile volley at Israel recently, where they saw the proxy strategy with Hezbollah's defeat, or not defeat, but Hezbollah's big blows that they have absorbed in Lebanon, and the success of the Israeli air campaign at taking out a lot of their weapons. They have not been able to hit back against Israel in as big a manner or as effective a manner as I think a lot of us would have assumed would have happened before this episode started playing out. And so with that, really hard hit to Hezbollah, and Iran really was at kind of a put up or shut up moment where they had to come in and join the fight. And I don't think they wanted to escalate to that level, but with Hezbollah, facing defeat by Israel, they were really at a point where they were going to face a large loss of credibility if they didn't step in at that point. We also, with the second volley of missiles that they fired recently. Unlike the April attack, they used newer and more capable systems. And, unfortunately, one of the things that we learned from that is that those systems penetrate at a higher rate and were more effective. There were a lot of them that were shot down, but the ballistic missiles that they used, if you look at the satellite photos that have been floating around of the Israeli air bases there were a couple dozen of them that got through and hit at least near their targets. And so that's, has to be worrisome for Israel looking forward, because if that had been on we didn't have any Israelis killed. There was unfortunately one person in the West Bank who a piece of debris fell on. But if that had been targeted against civilian targets or infrastructure that was not in hardened bunkers like they had on the air bases, that would have been, a much different story. So we've learned that about the efficacy of those. Israel's obviously going to respond soon, probably within the next few days. President Biden has been trying to influence that. And there have been a few kind of somewhat clumsy public statements. He was asked about oil and he said, well, we're discussing that. And we got a $2 movement on crude in the minutes after that. But he's also been clear that the U.S. does not support a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities at this point. And, he later came out and kind of clarified the comment about oil, saying that we were trying to dissuade them from hitting oil as well. And there are good reasons for doing so, as I've written recently, and we'll get into. But how effective will the U.S. influence on that be? Not sure, but it doesn't, it doesn't look like we're going to really be deciding the target list for this. We have talked to Israel about a number of escalatory points up to now in this conflict, and the track record for Biden talking Netanyahu out of taking escalatory steps is not very good. I think that in the absence of a willingness by the Biden administration to exert pressure in terms of withholding munitions, which they're clearly not willing to do at this point, we're kind of waiting to see what they do, trying to influence it. But there's a lot of reason in recent history to believe that we probably may not be able to influence the targeting decisions. If Israel did target the nuclear sites, I think, at that point, all bets are off. That's definitely the high end of the list. It would certainly, present an incentive for them to move to weaponization where they had not been, at least thus far, taking action in that direction. I think it also would really up the ante in terms of escalation that might draw in the U.S. It also might, I think they would probably also think that given some of the limitations on Israel in terms of being able to use the largest bunker buster weapons, the Iranians very well might think that the U.S. was planning to deliver a second blow right after that. And that might be an assumption that they would be working with just based on, the limitations of Israel's capabilities. So that would be more dangerous in terms of drawing the U.S. in, and I think would be very dangerous in terms of, even if they did a lot of damage to the Iranian program, you're still looking at something where you can't kill the knowledge, and they could rebuild it, and they might be able to recover the 60% HEU that they've already been able to produce, and that would be a very dangerous situation in all of those directions. Targeting oil, as I've written recently, it's tempting because that is Iran's major source of hard currency revenue and their economic lifeline. And Iran has been increasing their oil shipments recently. They're up to exporting about 2 million barrels a day, most of that to China. But there's a little bit of it in dribs and drabs that's been going elsewhere, which is new this year. That would take away, if you targeted the export infrastructure, that would take away one of the big deterrents against them later targeting Arab oil, which is that, that mutual vulnerability where if Iran hit Arab oil, they could assume that the Arab countries could target theirs. That's a very important mutual vulnerability that might have kept oil out of the escalation path, because they know that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates both have superior air forces that on their own, without US or Israeli help, could go and destroy Karg Island and the key facilities themselves. A variant of that would be targeting the Abadan refinery, which would hamper their ability to deliver refined product to the domestic market. That perhaps might be a little bit less dangerous, but I think targeting oil infrastructure does raise that risk of them targeting oil infrastructure in a tit-for-tat manner, and being less deterred in that. Biden has, as I mentioned, Biden has discouraged that. I think another factor that mitigates against it a little bit is the fact that Iran had the normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. So the Iran-Saudi relationship had been improving in general terms over the last couple of years. It's not something that I think Iran would really want to do, but is something that when backed into a corner, they might feel they needed to do as one of the only ways that they could up the ante and hit back. The threat there, just briefly, and I can get into this more in the Q&A, people talk about closing the Strait of Hormuz. That's secondary to the real threat. The real threat is much more a larger version of the strike that they made on Abqaiq and Khurais, the Saudi onshore infrastructure in 2019. that ended up being a pretty minor event because the Iranians intentionally only targeted a fraction of the capacity, and the facility runs at well below full capacity, taking sulfur out of the oil. And so that was something that didn't really cause any economic damage. But if you went back and did exactly the same thing and damaged triple the number of desulfurization towers that they hit the last time, you would have a real problem on your hands with millions of barrels a day offline in a way that couldn't be fixed as quickly as just repiping around the damage the way they had done before. Finally, I've given some, giving some thought to the question of where does this end? And unlike a lot of wars where you have an exchange between two powers at a remove from each other without any real ground forces involvement, the question of how that ends is, a bit less defined. There's also, when you think about, if there were contacts during these exchanges, back channels between Iran and Israel, what would they negotiate over? It's not as if Iran is going to be doing a nuclear deal with them. It's not as if there's going to be anything on the Israeli path. There's not a lot to negotiate over. And so it seems like something that would kind of be a fire that would perhaps burn itself out over time, but it almost certainly would end inconclusively without any sort of agreement, on a ceasefire, between the parties, at least not something that would resolve a lot of things. Which raises the last question I'll throw out, is this a mowing the lawn scenario where it ends indecisively, Iran rebuilds capabilities, and Israel and possibly the US end up having to do this again pretty soon? And I think that's another unanswered question, but it's an important one. And with that, I will hand over to Josh.
Josh, take it away.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. Today's a day not just for memorializing the events of October 7th, but it's a day for think tank people all over the world to showcase their wares. And when you look at a sampling of all the different products and the different podcasts that have been coming out in the last couple days for the anniversary, they all tend to focus on, as we are, the effects for the region over the long term. But really, all they're really doing is circling around what will become of the peace process, what will become of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, and to some extent, where does Iran go from here? And there's two reasons for that. The first one is that in most of the region, politics go on as usual. Not much has changed over the last year for most of the region. Algeria and Tunisia held elections. Tebboune and Kais Saied both returned to another term. Kais Saied, I believe today, had 89% approval from the voters, but with low voter turnout. Egypt's convening its national dialogue. Kuwait has suspended its parliament. I was just in Kuwait. A lot of Kuwaitis are very happy about that. It's kind of a hidden secret over there. Iraq continues to discuss the theft of the century, the wiretapping plot in the prime minister's office. There's not a whole lot of impact from the war on day-to-day politics in most of the rest of the region. The big changes are all taking place within the axis of resistance. Hezbollah has been repeatedly and publicly humiliated, and there's no avoiding that. And we can speculate about what Hezbollah will look like afterwards, how the organization will transform and learn lessons from this. But there's no getting around the fact that it has been publicly shamed within the Lebanese political sphere, and that's going to have some impact moving forward. Number two, the containment of the Houthis is now fully in play. Previous to this, there were U.S. strikes on selected Houthi targets. There were sanctions in place, but it wasn't a full containment strategy, in part because the economic lifeline to the north, Hodeida port, wasn't going to be touched by the Western powers. There was a great fear that this could cause a humanitarian disaster. So much humanitarian aid flows through there. Well, the Israelis have done the job. And so that taboo has been broken. And in that sense, you now have a much more full containment policy towards the Houthis, de facto, if not de jure. And then the third big change among the axis of resistance, Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, has appeared as an old, frail man who's either incapable or unwilling to take more effective action. And the truth is, it's probably a bit of both. Uh, he was up on stage for the first time in almost 5 years delivering a Friday sermon just this week, holding a gun in the hand. It was probably not the optic that the Iranian government would have been seeking had it thought through what we're going to do as a PR rollout post missile strike. Um, Anyways, it's too soon to say what's changed after a year of war. Most people are still focused on the heat of the battle and on what's happening next on the front lines, but it's not hard to imagine a few scenarios that'll play out as a result of the conflict. The first scenario I can imagine would be what's going to happen with the transition of power in Iran. Now, the older generation of the Islamic Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, they built up an entire industry around the concept of resistance. That was pretty much all they could achieve in the 1980s. That's the older generation. Today, the younger generation within the IRGC, they can justify their existence based on tangible political and military gains across the region, in Iraq and in Syria and Yemen over the last 15 to 20 years. A type of success that their parents' generation could never have dreamed of in a certain sense. And I should think that the ranks of the armed forces, the IRGC, the paramilitary units, they would describe the current regional response to Gaza as a failure of their parents' generation, their parents who are still clinging to power in their 70s and 80s. And the comparison with Egypt in the 1950s is apt. Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers looked at their government's loss against Israel in 1948, and they ascribed it to the failure of a corrupt and incompetent old guard that needed to be replaced. The future victory for them in Israel could only take place after victory in their own political sphere back in Cairo had been achieved. I would imagine one of the lessons learned the IRGC is going to take away from this is that they need to be thinking along those lines as well. That decay and corruption within the ranks of the Islamic Republic are the hindrance to a more effective response to Israel's actions against Iran and its proxies. And that's going to have implications for the upcoming transition of power. Khamenei is not going to be around forever. And the IRGC is going to have to figure out how they fit into a government moving forward when that's done. Second scenario that I can easily imagine playing out from this is the blame game among the axis of resistance. There's going to be a lot of finger pointing when everything is said and done. We might be seeing signs of that already. Hamas was sure that Hezbollah would join in the war from the outset, and it was disappointed when they didn't. Hezbollah no doubt feels that Syria has an obligation to step into the fray, and it must feel as a betrayal after so many years of Hezbollah defending the regime in Damascus during the civil war to see Bashar on the sidelines. All parties could be looking to Iran for answers when it's said and done. There's no answer for Iran's restraint except that it's either incapable of mounting an effective attack against Israel, or it's unwilling to risk a counterattack that destabilizes the regime. And I think most Iran experts probably agree it's a bit of both. Since Iran can't restore deterrence against Israel, and it's unlikely to do so following the war, the time for that will be over by then. It means its proxies will almost certainly lose confidence in Tehran, and that has implications. Iran projects strength in the region and in the world precisely through being or assuming the image of being at the head of a coalition that may not always operate under its direct control, but at least shares a common cause, and Iran is always the one shaping that cause, that agenda. That may not be the case moving forward. The militias that are affiliated with Iran may decide they're just as good at defining this agenda as Iran is following this war. And then there's the issue of resetting the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I use the term reset because I think that's probably the language that's going to come out post-election. We'll see what happens. But I imagine you're going to see on both sides, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, no matter who wins, you're going to see attempts by advisors on both sides to come up with a way, a language for talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship that puts what happened into the past. And for that, the most common term in US politicking in the last 10 years is resetting the relationship. So I imagine that's what we're going to default to. Certainly, if Trump wins, a reset's the easiest way to frame was essentially a boost in bilateral ties, one in which Washington agrees to pursue some notional form of regional peace talks, with the Abraham Accord countries in the lead, while at the same time doubling down on security assistance. And on the other side, in the Harris campaign, admittedly, they've done a lot to distance themselves from the war while maintaining a show of support for Israel's defense. That's been very hard to sit in the fence for the last year while they've done that. It meant targeted sanctions against settler groups and a big debate about arms sales. But I would imagine that even if Harris wins, there's going to be a delay of a few months from November to January to the inauguration while her team figure out who to appoint for these positions, what approach to adopt. And if Israel's wrapped up major operations in Gaza and Lebanon by January, and maybe even held elections, who knows, it'll be in a position to go to Washington and make the case that what's past is past. We all need to think about the future. And that'll offer the new administration coming in a bridge to return to some sort of status quo in the U.S.-Israel relationship. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for those stimulating observations. I want to address a question that Josh can answer first and then Greg can respond to, which is there, Josh, really any wrapping up in the Gaza Strip? Washington Post just ran an article about how Hamas planned to regroup even as it knew that it would face a major attack after it launched October 7th. Could this war or conflict not easily continue for another couple years? Josh?
There is no alternative solution for dealing with Gaza other than Hamas running the place. And that's a reality. It's a reality that I'm not sure the Israeli public has come to fully understand or accept yet, but eventually it's hard to imagine any other alternative that is going to be feasible. Hamas will be crippled. It'll be suffering. It's the people in Gaza are going to be up in arms about all the destruction that Yahya Sinwar has rained down upon them. It's going to be very difficult for Hamas to govern. They're going to be beset by all sides. It'll even be hard for humanitarian groups to get any assistance in. And the only way for Hamas to then govern is to arrest, torture, imprison, disappear people even more than they were doing before. But I think that's the reality that we face. There's no coalition of Arab partners that's going to be willing to go in with boots on the ground. There are no number of local clans or families in Gaza that are going to step up and collaborate with the Israelis, certainly not without getting shot in the back by Hamas supporters. The Israelis themselves aren't going to go in and occupy Gaza the way that they did prior to 2006. You can only imagine the Israelis setting up a defensive corridor along the edge in which they can conduct nightly raids against selected targets that they still feel they need to get, including Yahya Sinwar, and then struggling with Egypt about what to do with the Philadelphia corridor. But sort of the security envelope that'll be along the entire side of Gaza, that'll persist for a long time. Nightly raids will persist for a long time. Hamas overnight attacks we'll be hearing about for a long time to come. And that'll fester, yeah, absolutely, for any number of years. But there's no other solution to any of this.
Greg, what's your take?
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. It is hard to defeat a group engaging in guerrilla warfare as long as they still have some public support and are able to recruit people. From what has come out in the reporting, it seems that the U.S. intelligence community sees Hamas getting new recruits, filling out their ranks. There are people who are willing to take up the arms of those who've fallen. And so I agree that I don't think Israel is going to end up occupying it permanently. And it probably, even if there is not a war going on there, there's going to be a low level back and forth of violence. But there's not going to be any solution that allows some other entity, the Palestinian Authority or the Egyptian army or some other external actor, to come in and govern it. It's very hard to see any of those working.
Now, the Biden administration has sought to rein in Israel, but it has failed. What are the odds that Israel does indeed launch a massive strike on Iran? Josh?
I'm probably not the best person. I'm really more of an expert of the Arab Gulf states, but uh, I think throughout the last year, Netanyahu has kept everyone on a weak footing by their own fault because people simply couldn't conceive of him going one step further and one step further and one step further. Um, uh, it seems from the way the operations have been going in Lebanon for the last couple weeks, which are surprisingly organized, surprisingly efficient, uh, uh, very highly focused and well provided with intelligence by all appearances. Um, it would seem that Israel both has a much higher tolerance for risk than the rest of the international community gives them that it gives Israel credit for, and the Israeli government has uh, a much further vision in its plans for extending the war than the rest of the world has given it credit for. So I think it would be wrong to underestimate Netanyahu's willingness to go the next step.
Greg?
I certainly, as I said, I don't think that the Biden White House pressure on them is going to be the deciding factor. And I agree with Josh that, they have been very bold and ambitious and willing to take risk. Biden may have exerted enough pressure that the nuclear sites wouldn't be in this first round. But this is only, the first round of direct Israeli strikes on Iran. There are probably going to be multiple rounds of back and forth. So getting to that point at some point seems reasonably probable.
Let me sharpen it, Greg. Since you were talking about the efficacy of an Israeli attack, because, we know that these nuclear facilities are buried very, very deep. Do you think Israel would cross the nuclear threshold?
No, I don't think so. That would be that would probably cause a breach in the relationship with you. And I don't think they would need to, but Israel has bunker busters like the ones that they used, the GBU 109s that they used on the Hezbollah bunker. They don't have the largest, massive ordnance penetrator like we do that need to be delivered by B2s because they're just physically that big and heavy. But you might have a scenario like I laid out where Israel strikes first, but then the US kind of needs to go finish that job. And at that point, it might make sense to do so. And that's one way that, we could end up getting sucked into that. But if there were a strike that were not as, that's really where we could end up, is with the US needing to finish the job at some point, because of those unique capabilities that we have. But, it goes back to the other question I raised, which is, are we in a mowing the lawn scenario? Because this doesn't kill the knowledge. They know how to build the centrifuges. They know how to source the parts, even under sanctions. So this is all going to grow back, even if you kill it off temporarily.
Josh, you mentioned your expertise in the Gulf states before. Are the Gulf states encouraging Israel to proceed again in Lebanon and in Gaza?
Okay, from what little I know, from contacts in the region, traveling around the last few weeks, almost all of the leadership in the Gulf stopped talking directly to Bibi early on during this conflict, at least directly. They'd probably still pass messages here and there and everywhere, but the exception probably being Abu Dhabi. I would imagine that Mohammed bin Zayed still has a line of communication, if only because the Emiratis are deeply involved in figuring out what the day after looks like for Gaza. And for that, they've been working very closely with the Jordanians and coordinating with the Egyptians and the Americans and the Israelis, naturally, on what to do about governance in Gaza. When I was just out in the Gulf just a couple weeks ago, I don't know what to say about this. Obviously, no one's happy about the war, uh, and no one has any love lost for Netanyahu. Um, and there was still a lot of hope that some sort of normalization between Saudi and Israel could be worked out. Uh, but it was very clear from Mohammed bin Salman's speech to the public on TV that this wasn't going to happen without some sort of resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was pointed out to me that uh, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman spoke at that lecture from the desk that King Faisal had once owned. And this would be something that the domestic audience might understand better than the international audience. Um, there's a lot of symbolism tied up in that. Um, but I don't know that there's much more to say about Gulf views of the conflict.
Greg, do you have any thoughts or?
I agree. I mean, I think the Gulf Arab point of view is mainly that they would like to avoid being harmed by this. It's not a situation they started, but their infrastructure is highly vulnerable, and they're worried about a dent in oil revenues that could last 6 months if the worst case scenario is played out, and that would be a huge financial blow to them.
Yeah, the bigger issue even for them on oil price is what happens if President Trump wins again, former President Trump gets reelected. The biggest issue for them is they predict that he will pump out as much gas and oil and engage in as much fracking as possible, and it's going to dramatically lower the price internationally. That for them is much more of a concern than what the current conflict will do to the price of
So
oil.
So having worked with that industry a lot, I'll step in on that one.
Yeah.
Most of it, there really is not a big partisan difference in how much is going to be produced. It's mostly rhetorical. What is slowing down action in the activity in the U.S. oil patch right now is prices, and so prices are already doing that. And I think the Saudis have actually shifted a little bit. There was that article in the FT recently where Saudi sources were telling the FT that they were gradually reclaiming a bit of market share. And so they don't want that to play out catastrophically where they open the spigot all at once and get in a price war, but they're trying to manage a transition back toward getting some of that market share back. And if they have to accept that they're going to be at $70 a barrel for a couple of years to have that chilling effect, they seem to be willing to do it.
Mr. Netanyahu's fortunes seem to be at their nadir after October 7th. And now he's rebounded. He's lecturing foreign leaders about Israel's need to go on the offensive and why it's leading a righteous battle or even crusade. Are the naysayers wrong? Has this aggressive posture actually paid off? Is Israel in an extremely strong position right now? Josh?
Yeah, Bibi's speech over the holiday weekend this last weekend, he very explicitly trumpeted the fact that he's basically saying this is a new regional order that's being created. Um, yeah, I mean he's right in a sense. He has reason to be uh, confident. When you look at the destruction that's rained down on Hezbollah, nobody thought this could happen, and it is a dramatic turnaround. That change in the regional order may be short-lived. It may be temporary. It may not last very long. Um, as Greg was saying, it's hard to imagine a fundamental shift in the regional order unless a real land war breaks out, not just skirmishes along the northern border with Lebanon, destruction of ammo depots and stockpiles, but an actual land war of occupation in Lebanon, or unless you can imagine, you know, which Greg agrees would be impossible, Iranian conventional armed forces getting involved in an all-out full-scale war. Or if you can imagine the former March 14th forces, Sadr and the like in Lebanon, organizing themselves as a competent and effective political machine, which they weren't even able to do back in the mid 2000s, let alone today. So it's hard to imagine the conditions shifting in such a way that you have new structural constraints that change the fundamental calculus of Iran and its proxies and its allies in the region. That is hard to imagine. So what Bibi thinks he's doing may have a short shelf life, just as Bibi's political career may have a short shelf life.
Greg, short shelf life?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I mean, it's very impressive what Israel has been able to do to Hezbollah. And it is clear that, I mean, the intelligence work that went into this was amazingly effective. They seem to, when you look at a lot of these strikes on South Beirut where they've used bunker busters, they seem to have known exactly where the munitions were stored and hit those tunnels and done so pretty effectively. But this leaves a lot of thorny, larger questions. And particularly the Palestinian population is still there in the territories and they're not going anywhere. And so that is still a festering situation that there's no good answer for, but he is pulled in a rightward direction. There's not really any, it's hard to see with the Israeli political spectrum where it is right now, which has drifted quite a bit farther right. And what happened a year ago today, understandably, made Israelis even more skeptical of coexistence. But I think that's going to continue to be an albatross, and also have some impact on their relationship with the West.
But I want
If I
to
can
put
jump in, if I
something.
can jump in, just
Sure.
one
Yeah.
more thought. You know, Netanyahu doesn't need to realign the forces of the region. He doesn't need a structural realignment of what everyone's doing. He just needs to get through the next few months that he can end the war, declare his own version of total victory, and move on to an election where he can hope to scrabble together a coalition and rename himself prime minister. We can never forget the fact that politics matters more than anything here. And in that regard, he may have achieved what he wants to achieve. We have to watch carefully over the next couple months about the rhetoric coming out of Jerusalem and how Netanyahu's government defines total victory. It seems that his rhetoric is moving in that direction. And then that will have the knock-on effect in terms of when he will then be willing to hold an investigation into October 7th, how he will approach it, and how he'll allow elections or move into elections. All of this is posturing for what happens after the war in terms of the election cycle in Israel.
I want to pose something to both of you about the Gaza Strip. I mean, the New York Times has a piece today that says that it has become a death trap. Famine, disease, polio, bombs raining down on the population. They can't leave. Is this just the future of this for these 2.3 million people that the world is going to watch while this area is uninhabitable, ungovernable? How do you see these prospects?
Everyone's going to lean hard on the Gulf states to step in with major financial assistance for reconstruction and development. Right now, no doubt the Gulf states are saying to themselves, we're not going to be the ATM for the world. We've done this too many times. Both Qatar and Saudi Arabia have repeatedly thrown money into Gaza. And it all has to be done with Israeli coordination, which is a long, slow, tedious process. Every ounce of construction material that goes in has to be approved and reapproved by the Israeli authorities, monitored with end user notifications, etc. It's a nightmare for any country that wants to take on board this task. And so right now, I have no doubt the Gulf states are recoiling in horror from the idea of what it's going to take, not just in terms of dollar signs, which is not the issue, but in terms of hassle of coordination and the bureaucracy and the difficulty of diplomacy with the Israelis in managing it. But I would imagine that when all is said and done, there will be a fund set up largely backed by the Arab Gulf states. And it'll be then up to the Western nations to pressure Israel to allow them to do what they have to do to restore some sense of order and health and sanity to the people of Gaza.
Greg?
Yeah, I think that's one point. I agree with what Josh just said, but I think that's one point where the U.S. election probably does matter a lot. If Harris were elected, I think there would be a focus on trying to figure out where these administrative bottlenecks are and trying to make that a more reasonable process. And a Trump administration wouldn't. So I think in the Trump scenario, things might look a bit more grim.
I wanted to pose to each of you, what would you recommend if you were advising the incoming administration? What would your posture be towards Israel? Josh?
Oh, I'm not really sure it's necessarily. I mean, you can frame the question that way. I think it's more appropriate to say the Israelis are going to be in the driver's seat in determining the language and rhetoric and approach to restoring the relationship to its former mark. I think that the new administration coming in is going to be on the back foot in that regard. So if you have to give advice to whatever administration is coming in, the only advice you can give is be prepared for a full frontal assault from every lobbyist and advocacy organization in town, who are going to be armed with a single set of talking points to which whatever new administration takes shape will not have their own talking points in response formulated, ready to go, and up and running when that happens. I would offer one piece of advice vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and that is the next administration cannot get sucked up into managing single-handedly the diplomacy surrounding reconstruction assistance to Gaza, because that will be the end of policy on the Palestinian issue. It'll be way too easy for the U.S. government to commit its time and energy and bandwidth to this all-encompassing difficult issue of how to get humanitarian assistance in and manage it and do oversight of it, to the exclusion of any other sort of political engagement. You'll have plenty of other countries in the region and the world pressing and beating down our door in Washington, demanding that the U.S. intervene and resolve these problems. So it'll just be too tempting to fall into that groove and ignore the fact that the U.S. does have an important role to play in shaping peace and governance moving forward.
So what I would say is, two things that I would do a bit differently than current policy. One is that, I do think that the U.S., the Biden administration has been very feckless in dealing with Netanyahu on, there have been times where he has tried to put ultimatums out on how much food aid is getting in and such. And it's effective for a very short period of time, and then the obfuscation comes back. And I think one thing that we need to make clear is, while there is an American consensus for supporting Israel's security, the flow of arms should not be treated as sacrosanct. Temporary use of that as pressure in the manner that, say, President Reagan did in 1982 is appropriate and is not a lever of policy that should be off the table. And the second thing that I think we need to do is have a frank talk with them about the whole issue of our other commitments in the world, how much military force structure can be devoted there, and the fact that we don't want to be repeatedly drawn into any sort of mowing the lawn major deployments. We're not going to have the ability to have carriers there at present levels very much of the time. We're going to be fully engaged in dealing with a much larger threat in Asia. And so we have to think about resource allocation there. But I think we do need to be firm about the place of the Middle East in U.S. grand strategy as a secondary theater that must consume limited resources, and where we shouldn't be mowing the lawn.
Let me ask both of you as a final question. Josh, is what Greg said accurate? Is it a secondary region, or are we in fact doomed to be enmeshed in the Middle East at a price that we might not necessarily want, but can't avoid paying?
Washington has shifted. Things have changed. The capital of the world's greatest superpower is not the same as when I started 20 years ago. China and Russia are all that matters. That's what the young people are getting their language skills in and their degrees in. It's what the government is training. It's where the jobs are. If you want to do China in the Middle East, then there are jobs for you. Yes, in Washington. Is it always going to be that way? No, I mean, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, who knows what the situation will be and what fad occupies our attention. But this war is not going to change the fact that the US government has made a strategic pivot in its staffing, recruiting, training, and general manpower patterns towards Russia and China. And that's just part of the reality for a professional like mine. You look at how think tank experts have changed in the last 2 generations. You go to our parents' generation, most of the people at these think tanks were former US government experts, mostly from the intelligence services, from military intelligence or the CIA, INR, whatever it might be, Treasury. They had all worked in the government together. They all had a sense of each other. They all had respect for each other. And they all went to the think tanks in the late 90s and 2000s and made the end of their career there. And then you look at the next generation of folks that have come in their place. It's young people who got PhDs or people from the region, Lebanese, Egyptians, etc., who have come to Washington to make a name for themselves. When you look at the next generation, it's hard to envision even that level of expertise. It'll be people who have bounced around doing China, Russia, and the like in relation to the Middle East and are now experts on that subtopic of the field.
Greg?
Yeah, I agree with most of that. And yeah, it has changed. It has changed a lot. Going back to the point I made before, this is not the primary region anymore. And it is changed the way the U.S. government approaches it. But we're always going to be engaged there, though. We're not going to be withdrawing. We're not going to get down to where we have 0 forces in the region, despite a few people advocating for that. But it definitely is not going to be positioned where it was in the past.
Well, it sounds like our 2 experts are in a way downgrading the significance of the region that they're preoccupied with, but I'm not sure that was their intention.
And one last point, if I can just throw this out there.
Yeah.
Oil, a lot of people in Washington talk about, we don't get our oil from there anymore. The fungibility concept is still there. And even as transportation moves off of oil, petrochemicals are still going to be important. So the Gulf will have strategic significance for energy and industry, through the rest of our lifetimes, even though it will be at a somewhat lower level.
Well, that was actually very interesting. I thank both of you for joining us. I don't know if we've solved these issues because they always seem to be inconclusive, and the Middle East seems to be mired in perpetual conflict. But I guess we'll have fodder for another session in the future. Thanks, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.